inspiring people with curious minds, harnessing data and technology, working seamlessly and inclusively, always learning from patients. AstraZeneca R&D, helping unlock the power of what science can do.
AT&T is helping business move forward, and together, we've changed the way things get done. From redefining collaboration, top of the line here, to coming up with new ways to serve customers and deliver products.
This one is cheddar. It's delicious.
So as your business keeps moving forward,
Oh, you look so healthy.
you can rely on the people and the network of AT&T to help keep your business connected. Let's take care of business. AT&T.
Thank you for joining us. Our program continues now.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us at the Maryland Tech Council's Advocacy Summit. We're very appreciative to have you here. More importantly, we're appreciative for all that you allow us the opportunity to do on behalf of our members. The Maryland Tech Council serves over 500 members in the state of Maryland across the technology and biotechnology industries, really two major and significant industries that help to grow the economy and offer jobs and prosperity for the state of Maryland. I'm Brad Stewart. I'll be your host for this session. I am the Senior Vice President of Business Development for the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, and I'm also the Chair of the Maryland Life Sciences Organization. This is an important topic for me. This day is an important day for me. This is now my 25th year in the state of Maryland working in the life sciences industry, and that time has been spent really hoping to continue to grow this industry and help it to be more successful. So with that, we're going to talk about a couple of important issues facing us in the United States these days. I'm joined by two esteemed guests. Our first is Sharon Lamberton, who's with PhRMA. And our second guest is Elissa Alben with Pfizer. So Sharon, I'm going to start with you. Sharon works with PhRMA as the Deputy Vice President for State Policy and External Outreach. In that role, she gets to work with the National Governors Association and legislatures across the United States to help them understand the policies that they need to put in place responsibly to help assure access to medications for patients, help to deal with compliance. And so Sharon, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you've ended up in this role?
Sure. Thank you, Brad, for inviting me and all that the Maryland Tech Council does. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Alyssa, and I look forward to today's discussion. I'm Sharon Lamberton. I'm a nurse by training, and I've been at PhRMA for almost 19 years. As you know, PhRMA is a trade association of 33 different biotech companies, and we are brand name companies that bring innovative medicines and cures to market. So when I started as a registered nurse with clinical trial background at NIH, I began my career in healthcare lobbying for a seniors association and have been at PhRMA again for about 19 years working in state policy and external outreach with provider and patient groups. And it's just never a dull moment because I truly believe in what our industry is doing for our patients.
Thanks, Sharon. I appreciate that. Alyssa, you're with Pfizer and you're the Vice President of, for their global affairs, legislative affairs, and trade policy. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and the role you serve at Pfizer?
Sure. So I am a relative newcomer to the industry. I've been in this at Pfizer's for 3 years, but my background is I spent about 20 years in international policy. So I spent a long time working on Capitol Hill and in the administration of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. And so I have spent a long time thinking about international policy issues like a global competitiveness and intellectual property protection and all these issues that I think really are really critical for the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, thanks, Alyssa. That's great. So there's two major topics we're going to talk about here today. The first is Build Back Better and the provisions that are proposed that affect our life sciences industry here in the United States. And the second will be TRIPS, which is Alyssa will talk about more in depth, but are essentially trade protocols to potentially provide intellectual property to other nations, to essentially give away the intellectual property of an intellectual property owner to other parties. So Sharon, we're going to start with you. I was hoping you could give us a little bit of an update on what's going on with Build Back Better, what it is in there that might affect life sciences companies. We have a lot of life science companies here in the state of Maryland. Many of those are multinational companies, but just as many, if not more of those, are small startup companies that are the future of medicine here in America. Companies that are developing new cell therapies, new gene therapies, and the ones that really depend on what's going to happen in those future policies to be able to invest their money to create new medications today.
Thank you, Brad. And it is true, Maryland is a gem. They have so much, the state of Maryland has so much going on in the way of clinical trial development and research. Just looking at COVID, our pandemic, I would be remiss to say, we have 2,131 clinical trials underway worldwide on vaccines and treatments. And of those 2,167 are in the state of Maryland. Maryland, employs a huge number of jobs, about 129,000 direct jobs, and all of the research and development that companies are doing is so important to the future of patients. That's why the Build Back Better Act is something that not just Maryland, but the entire country needs to pay attention to, because in my 19 years at the pharma industry, I have never seen a piece of legislation that could truly decimate research and innovation like this one can. While there are really interesting and good components in the BBBA for some people, for example, there's an out-of-pocket maximum cap that is smoothed over the year, that is $2,000. That's the most a senior would pay. There's an insulin copay cap, but more importantly, what it does to innovation is quite scary. And I know Alyssa is going to bring an interesting parallel to how this BBBA, and you just simply need to look at the other countries who have price controls and look at access and life longevity and the reduced access to medicines that other countries have. But there are three ways the BBBA is harmful. And luckily, as of last night, it looks like this language as a package is not going to go forward. President Biden had a press conference, and after the voting rights bill, which was a long shot, failed, about 52 votes, I think they opposed the voting rights, which was a sneaky way to get around the rules to try to push the BBBA. But as you know, in there's 50 votes that must happen in a 100-seat majority. You need 50 in the Senate to pass, and with two Democrats that disagree, being Senator Manchin and Schumer, it looked like it wasn't going to pass. So what our president had said last night is that it looks like it'll be broken up in pieces, or it could be seen later on in a CMMI demo. But what the three areas, Brad and Alyssa, that I wanted to mention today for our seminar and our symposium here is that there's three areas where this is problematic. One is that it destroys R&D because it starts price setting. The government dictates to manufacturers how much they need to sell a drug for. And that's frightening in and of itself. Secondly, it harms innovation because it really disincentivizes generics and biosimilars from coming to market. And that's part of the life cycle that we support. There's no other aspect in healthcare where drugs, except drugs that go down over time, patents expire and makes headroom for the generics to come into market. And then, of course, new brand innovative products. And the third and final way that this is really problematic is that it really hurts post-approval research. As you know, and as I know as a nurse in my work at NIH and clinical trials, a lot of great work is done after FDA approval, especially in cancer. So this effectively would be halted should the BBBA pass in its current form.
Thanks, Sharon. I appreciate that. It's interesting, and you as a healthcare provider, I think can possibly provide some light to this. I think one of the challenges I've seen over the decades in this industry is just how little people understand about manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and their relationship to drug pricing. It's a very unusual industry in most cases where you manufacture a product and yet you have no control over what that product is sold for. You can't sell a product to a customer. You have no relationship with the end user of the product. that product gets sold to a third party who then sells it. It gets distributed to pharmacy chains who then fulfill that to the patient. It's the doctor who decides which drug a patient uses. So there's a lot that gets lost in the complexity of our industry and ultimately how little the companies have to do with what the patient ultimately gets charged for a drug. So we understand that's a problem at the end of the day. There are definitely circumstances where patients' copays are exorbitant or a drug's not covered by their insurance plan. What are your thoughts and pharma's thoughts on how we actually deal with the problem of what a patient has to pay for a drug?
Thank you. And Brad, you really described what is one of the most complex subjects in healthcare, which is the complexity of the supply chain. A lot of people say to Alyssa from Pfizer and me from PhRMA, don't your companies or doesn't your company set the price? And as you beautifully stated, we are one of the cogs in a very big wheel that include PBMs, plans, and others. So we are not the ones that dictate price. And in fact, there was a recent study just released this month that said that more than half of medication spend goes to those other third-party stakeholders, such as PBMs and plans, not the manufacturer of the drug and not the patient, which is where I am going with solutions. Because the patient isn't receiving any of those point-of-sale discounts at the pharmacy to help them afford medicines, you look at healthcare plan designs, which are out of control. There are 4 and 5 tiers to health plans now. There are now drug-only deductibles, whereas in my early career of a nurse, we'd see 3 simple plans. And the healthcare plan design is making it incredibly difficult for patients to afford medicines and to stay on it. We know that if a drug is more than $250, patients tend to abandon them. So what can pharma and the other supply chain stakeholders do to improve the situation? Well, I think there are 3 things. One is sharing the rebates at the point of sale with the patient. Pharma industry spends more than $187 billion in rebates in 2020. A portion of that rebate should go to the patient to help them afford their medicines. You might say, Sharon, how's that being done? Well, there are plenty of ways to point to it being done, and one is occurring right now in the state of West Virginia. Share the Savings Bill, or HB 2263, was passed, and it is operational, and it is a best case example of how a state said, this isn't fair. We're going to make sure some of that savings does go to the patient at the point of sale in the pharmacy. Number 2 is accumulator adjustment program bans. This is a tool, AAP ban, that is used by healthcare plans to prevent assistance that might be given by manufacturers to patients in the form of coupons, and they prevent it from counting toward the patient's out-of-pocket deductible. This is unacceptable, and 11 states have said so because they've passed AAP bans. We also know that there's a federal bill that is addressing this very issue that's in play right now, and they have 16 co-sponsors right now. It's a bipartisan bill and is achieving a lot of attention for the patients that are pushing for it. And then finally, making sure the barriers to getting our products reviewed quickly and expeditiously is going to be very important. We don't want, we want to make sure that these price controls that are in HR 3 and now in the BBBA and perhaps in other things in the future, that is not the solution to affordable care. So those are some of the solutions we would proffer on both the federal and the state level. We know it can work. We're tired of finger pointing. We don't want to say it's the health plan's issue, and we don't want the health plans pointing back to us, because you know what? It's the patient issue, and we need to start working on solutions such as the ones I've articulated to help the patients.
Thanks, Sharon. And so a little bit of a complex question, because there's a lot I was hoping you could help answer here. You talked about PBMs. I don't think most people understand what a PBM is, what they do, and how they're involved in the supply chain. Maybe if you could help spell that out a little bit. And in part of that answer, I think something that's also very interesting from those of us in the industry, you hear a lot of talk about what increases in drug prices, what a drug price is, what their list price is. But most people have really no understanding that a list price of a drug has essentially nothing to do with what a drug company gets paid for a drug. It also has nothing to do with what a patient pays for a drug. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about what PBMs are and that sort of disconnect between list prices, what a manufacturer actually gets for a drug they make, and then if there's any correlation at all between that and what a patient actually pays.
You know, I really appreciate that. I'm going to break this into two parts. One is, what is a PBM? It's a pharmacy benefit manager. It's a middleman. And you might have heard just last week, President Biden talking about middlemen in the context of the food industry. He's angry with meat manufacturers overcharging grocery stores, which also overcharge patients. I wish he would have that same frustration with middlemen that are involved with medication pricing, because in fact, they did have value back in the 80s. And when they started, they were supposed to be a middleman that would help with multiple negotiations between health plans and wonderful pharma companies like Alyssa's at Pfizer and others. They had their value, they had their purpose. That purpose is over. And some of the studies that we have talked about where over half of medication spend is going to them and not the patient should illustrate that there's a huge problem and we need to address the supply chain and the rebate and the flow of the dollar because it's misappropriated. Now, you said something very important, Brad, and that a lot of people don't understand. You know, when you look at healthcare costs, the patient feels it. They know what they pay at the pharmacy counter, but it's not necessarily due to the price. It's due to the benefit design of their insurance. Because we look, and this is not pharma data, this is CMS government data that shows that prices, which are list prices, like a price of the car that is minus negotiated rebates and discounts, prices are going down 2.9% in 2020. That's right as the pandemic was about to begin, and prices are going down 2.9%. Drugs are 10 cents of the healthcare dollar and even less in Medicaid, about 5% of healthcare spend in Medicaid. The big part you say, Sharon, well, okay, if drugs are just such a small spend of healthcare in both Medicaid and in the overall context of healthcare expenditures, what's the driver? It's hospital care, it's provider care, it's long-term care, where we're seeing patients that are needing long-term care services. And again, not to point fingers, but to put cost in context is very important when you're having policy decisions that are directed to one industry exclusively and not looking at the entire supply chain and how to fix it. And then finally, we have to look at not just how prices are going 2.9%, but what's healthcare spend doing in general? Well, healthcare spend on drugs has only gone up 0.8%. And looking out 10 years, and again, this is CMS data, it's projected to stay in line with inflation, despite new therapies that are coming out. So putting it into context, it just drives home the point that we got to do something about the supply chain. Am I saying that we should completely get rid of PBMs? I don't know. That's for people of much greater titles than myself. However, I do know that patients aren't getting what they deserve. If patients get the medicines that they need, we spend less in the emergency room. We spend less on hospitalization. Patients can go to work. Productivity increases. Family caregiving issues are eliminated. So it's a win-win when patients are taking medicines. The return on investment is incredible. But we need to address exactly what you said, which is when you look at what the issue is, let's put it in context and see where exactly are the costs of medicines and how are they coming out. You might have said, just before I conclude, I might mention there was a CBO study that was released yesterday, and it showed that list prices are going down. In fact, in Medicaid, they're going down tremendously. And Medicare, it was going down from $57 to $50. And the same in Medicaid. So we know prices are going down for drugs. Now, how can we get patients the help that they need?
Thanks, Sharon. I appreciate that. One of the things that's I think sometimes hard for people to understand is just how limited the patent life of a drug typically is once it's on the market. I mean, we have a lot of factors that go into play here. Most drugs don't get approved. They fail along the development pathway. So there's an incredibly high rate of failure. Those typically have a lot of costs, even though they don't ever generate any revenue. The other thing is many of those that do finally make the market have exceptionally high costs to get to the market. Companies may invest $1 billion+ bringing a drug to market and have a very limited number of years to manage to keep funding their own business and to keep their research and development pipeline going so that, 6 years, 7 years down the road, there's more medications that become available. So that's one, if you have any commentary about that. And two, you mentioned before generic drugs. Can you provide some context on just how much of the United States market is not branded drugs that are actually drugs that are generic and not patent protected and just typically sold almost as a commodity in pricing?
Thanks, Brian. This brings us back full circle to the BBBA discussion as well. But to answer your question, you hit the nail on the head. Research and development is risky and it's expensive. It's $2.6 billion to bring a drug to market through the 3 phases that are required by the FDA. So $2.6 billion to bring a drug to market. Of that money, and of that time, it takes 10 to 12 years and 88% fail. You look at vaccines, which are quite important right now with the pandemic, 95% of vaccines fail. So that means we need as many shots on goal and attempts on goal as possible because we know that many won't make it. And who's waiting? Patients, providers, families. So we need to make sure that that pipeline remains robust. And if we have harmful policies like the BBBA or drug pricing proposals at this time, especially when we're trying to get out of a pandemic and we're trying to bring new drug treatments to market, it makes no sense to me. It makes absolutely no sense. I will mention one important thing that you said, Brad, is that BBBA it really allows the HHS secretary to dictate these prices. If a manufacturer says, no, I don't like that price, that's not good, I can't recoup my R&D, guess what? For non-compliance, they get hit with 95% excise taxes, which essentially takes almost all of their revenue of the drug they're trying to sell. So these price controls are unacceptable. It's going to harm innovation. Why would brand name medicine companies want to innovate in such a restrictive environment? And then more importantly, to your point, generics, which represent 91% of all medicines dispensed in the United States today, are really going to feel it. We think generics are great. A lot of people say, oh, you're brand drug trade association, you don't support generics. Absolutely, we do. There's a place and a value for generics whenever the healthcare provider thinks their patient needs it. And generics are very effective for some patients. And in fact, it saves healthcare a tremendous amount of money. In fact, I know that the savings for generics to the healthcare system has been wonderful, but this BBBA would effectively disincentivize any generics or biosimilars from entering the market because of the ceilings that they place on it. They don't have a floor. The HHS secretary is dictating price caps, and the list goes on. So this is clearly not the answer, especially in a context where we know the competition in the marketplace is working.
So thanks for that. I think one question we had from the audience that would be a good chance to try and answer that is, one of the other challenges we face is that there are certainly problems with the healthcare system in the United States. It's not just drug pricing. It's not just how patients get charged copays. It's a large number of things. But the attempts to fix these are wildly uncoordinated. We have a huge number of payers in the United States, which is confounding to most other countries in the world, quite honestly. So with the federal government and state governments and local governments all trying to do different and sometimes divergent things to try and improve the way healthcare is either provided here or paid for here, how does this actually get coordinated where something positive can happen rather than having different regulations everywhere if people try and do business and just further escalating the costs?
Great question, Brad. I think that we don't want exactly what you said, a patchwork quilt of state bills, and then we're trying to address it on the federal level. And I think the AAP ban issue is a perfect example of that. 11 states didn't want to wait for the federal folks to move. And so as often is the case, state legislators move more quickly. and they move in the best interests of the residents in their states. And that's what 11 states and Puerto Rico have done in passing AAP bans. It caught the attention, as you can imagine, of patient groups that said this should be nationwide. So you see the AAP ban that's out there now that is HR 5801. It's basically called the HELP Act, the Help Ensure Lower Copays. That's a bill that emulates those 11 state bills. So I think things are happening. It's moving. The appetite for and the frustration among patients and providers is evident. You need to be able to pay for your medicines at the pharmacy counter. You need to be able to take it to be healthy. This pandemic has illustrated how important it is that we address the comorbid conditions that are not treated, such as asthma and hypertension and other things like obesity. We got to get these things under control, and medicines are a key tool, along with lifestyle behaviors and other things your provider recommends in doing so. So I think you're absolutely right. The federal folks are catching on, and hopefully they will look at things like West Virginia's HB 2263 Share the Savings Bill. And hopefully the federal folks will look at the 11 bills on the AAP bans, et cetera, and want to replicate that.
Well, thanks, Sharon. And Alyssa, I want to bring you into this discussion, and we'll maybe transition over to TRIPS. But first of all, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to be here with us. I think if I said that Pfizer's been working round the clock for the last 2 years to help save the world, that wouldn't be hyperbole. The work that Pfizer's done is remarkable, and that's not to discount the work that people like Novavax here in Maryland have done, or AstraZeneca or Moderna, but it's actually almost incomprehensible, the fact that Pfizer was able to get not only a vaccine on market, but one that was so effective, one that was so complex, so new, and literally make billions of doses available to people around the world. So I want to thank you for that, and we do certainly appreciate it.
Well, I think, look, from my standpoint, the work of our manufacturing teams, the folks in the labs and on the factory floor, it's just the sacrifices that they have made. I think, the gratitude goes really to them. But they, and I share your view that across the industry, you've seen this very single-minded commitment to tackling the pandemic, which has really paid off. In what I would describe as almost a manufacturing miracle. I mean, we've really seen a tremendous response from the industry. So it's been thrilling to be a part of it.
And I think it's important, and it can't possibly be minimized how incredible it's been that this has happened. No one in the history of the world has ever seen a vaccine, or particularly a novel vaccine, brought to market in this period of time and scaled up to such remarkable levels. And something that's not simple to make. No one had ever made it before. Something that has to be kept cold. There's a lot of complexities in the supply chain involved with this. And that sort of turns to the topic we're going to talk about. And I'll let you explain what TRIPS are and everything else, but obviously you spent your career working in trade. You're an attorney by profession. So you've done this on a global basis and understand the complexities. I think one of the challenges we face is, when a company like Pfizer is willing to step up and sort of bet the company and its resources on a project and a problem this big, now there are a lot of calls saying, well, great, now that you've invested and put all the risk in, have managed to be successful, give it to us and let us do it too. And that I think creates a very powerful disincentive for people to put their careers at risk and put their employees' lives at risk and put their shareholders at risk. So with that sort of context, what is TRIPS and what's going on at the moment?
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, Brad, I think we've made a ton of progress in a very short period of time. And just to give everyone a picture of that, we, across the industry, about 11 billion vaccines were shipped in 2021. And for Pfizer and our partner BioNTech, we manufactured over 3 billion vaccines in 2021, and we plan to manufacture 4 billion in 2022. These are just extraordinary numbers, if you look at, the past as prologue. So I think we're seeing just a huge amount of output from the industry. And what drives that is partnerships, collaboration. We have seen a story of collaboration in the industry that I don't think we've ever seen before. Over 400 partnerships to manufacture vaccines and therapeutics between small companies, large manufacturers like us. You know, everyone is playing their part. And the question is what drives those partnerships? And that's where IP protection has come into the story. The TRIPS IP protections exist in federal law and they exist in the laws of other countries. The TRIPS agreement was an international agreement, and it's really a unique agreement because it includes, you know, over 150 countries have signed up for the rules, and it basically sets the baseline rules of the road for honoring IP globally. And when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of companies that had to immediately and quickly find partners, you know, who were innovating in this space and find ways to work with them. And the TRIPS rules basically set that background foundation that enables those collaborations to function. Of course, unfortunately, as you pointed out, early in the pandemic, we found that several countries started to make the case that maybe we needed to, you know, get rid of IP, that IP wasn't contributing, that was somehow a barrier to collaboration, to scale up of vaccine manufacturing. And so some countries put forward a proposal at the WTO to really just waive all those rules and create a bit of a free-for-all on IP protection for key COVID-related products, including vaccines, therapeutics, testing, and so forth. I would say, you know, there were a few challenges with that proposal. First of all, I think, as I said, you know, IP really was an enabler of our response. We could not have had the speed to partnership that we had without a stable, predictable environment for protecting intellectual property. Second, you know, the proponents of this waiver, I think they really kind of misconstrued what was the challenge, the real challenge to access. Because I think we would all agree that global access to vaccines is critical. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And I think the companies widely recognized that we needed to have global equitable access to vaccines. So for Pfizer's part, we committed 1 billion doses to low and middle income countries in 2021, and we delivered beyond that commitment in 2021. In 2022, we've got a similar commitment to another 1 billion doses to low and middle income countries. Companies are taking bold steps to address equity. And from the very beginning of the pandemic, we reached out to all countries to try to get them vaccine supply and to get agreements to supply vaccines to them. We have a tiered pricing strategy to ensure equitable access so that the lower income countries pay less than high income countries. A lot of thought was put into how we were going to get vaccines to those who most need it in these very challenging environments. Of course, what we've now seen is that we have manufactured a lot of vaccines, and the problems we're now encountering, of course, really go to increasingly issues other than manufacturing. So what are the challenges? What are the impediments to getting vaccines to countries around the world? And really, they've been issues like last mile distribution. As you said, some of these vaccines like ours have to be stored in ultra cold temperatures, and that can be challenging in some environments. So, building up the infrastructure necessary for vaccine distribution is a challenge. Ensuring that you have the healthcare workforce that's trained and ready to administer these vaccines can be a challenge in these countries. So it's scaling up all of the ecosystem that you need to have in place to distribute vaccines, I think, has been really critical. And it's increasingly a challenge that I think most in the healthcare, in the global context, would appreciate is what we really need to tackle. But unfortunately, instead of focusing on that issue, a lot of folks have been spending time trying to think about how to get rid of the IP rules. And, as I said, that's really not a productive way to respond to the pandemic. IP has been critical to our partnerships, and dismantling IP just creates a huge amount of uncertainty in the industry. it creates questions about, who's manufacturing the vaccines. It can create a scramble for the scarce resources we needed to make the vaccines. And it just really would have undermined our pandemic response.
Yeah, Alyssa, I think you started to point out a few critical problems there, right? And what is the real rate limiting step for people around the world getting vaccinated? In many cases, it's a lack of a healthcare infrastructure. There's literally no one there to provide vaccines to people, even if they had unlimited supplies of them. It's a cold chain. I mean, how many places do you have -20 freezers or other equipment necessary to take things out where there's no air conditioning, there's no plumbing or anything like that? Or even manage to get a second dose to a person when you have no way of tracking them or knowing that they're there. Vaccine hesitancy, unfortunately, is a real issue around the world, even worse in some places than parts of the United States. So there are a lot of big challenges. Some of those are more related to supply chain issues, which are unique to the mRNA vaccines. I will point out that Novavax, which is a Maryland company, from the day they started working on their vaccine, developed agreements with the Serum Institute of India, which is one of the largest producers in the world of vaccines. And Novavax's vaccine is different from an mRNA vaccine, that it is much more stable in lower temperatures. It's more the type of technology intended to go to developing markets and developing countries where that lacks that infrastructure. They have the ability to make billions of doses and are doing so in conjunction with the Serum Institute and other partners. You've said that Pfizer is making 1 billion doses per year available to countries around the world. Sorry about that. So how do those things come into context? Where is the real problem that's people don't see as being solved by the market already, I guess, is the issue.
Right. Well, I do think, people were very worried early on. They were worried about how the industry was going to respond. They were worried about how vaccines were going to be distributed. And I think, there really was, there are legitimate questions about equity that came up early in the pandemic. But to your point, Brad, I think that, the case of Novavax is a great one. We need to maintain strong IP protections, not just for the existing technologies, but to create the next generation innovation that's going to tackle some of the new challenges that we're facing in vaccine distribution. We need to incentivize the creation of new technologies, better vaccines. We're always trying to improve. And I think that that's where the IP system really creates that kind of strong baseline of predictability and the right incentives to facilitate that innovation that we're going to need for this pandemic and for the next one.
Well, I appreciate that. And we certainly appreciate everything that Pfizer's doing on this front. So where do things stand now with TRIPS? Sort of what is the status, next steps, any steps? Is it just sort of lurking in the background?
Well, it's an interesting question. So everything was kind of leading up at the end of last year to a big meeting of trade ministers that was supposed to happen at the World Trade Organization, where this issue was likely to be decided. Unfortunately, due to the Omicron outbreak, there were a number of travel restrictions that were put in place. Unfortunately, that meeting had to be postponed. It has not yet been rescheduled, but we do know that very key governments, the United States, India, South Africa, and Europe are being convened regularly to try to find a path forward. So it's gone but not forgotten. It is a live issue, and we really don't know where it will head next. I think the broader issue that's raised for all of us in the industry is this question about international IP protection. And I think it's been a real reminder of how important those international protections are. Sharon mentioned, Sharon talked a lot about the federal environment, and I think that's really one of the things that I think about on the international side is how do the policy environment that we set here in the United States, how does that set us up for success globally? Because Maryland companies are not just competing here in the United States, they have competitors all around the world. The biotechnology sector is more important than ever, and all governments recognize that. The pandemic has highlighted the value of this innovation, and frankly, every government in the world wants a piece of it. So we need to take this opportunity to set the right environment for innovation here in the United States to make sure that our American companies are as competitive as possible globally.
Well, thanks, Alyssa. And I'll ask a little bit of a snarky question, but with the innovation and the remarkable job has been done bringing vaccines to market for COVID during this pandemic. How many of the people watching this broadcast do you think would rather trade their Pfizer or Moderna or Novavax or AZ vaccine for the Chinese vaccine or the Russian vaccine?
Well, look, all I can tell you is that we are proud of our vaccines. We are proud of our technology, and we welcome anyone who would like to stand up and take a vaccine. What is most important is that everybody gets vaccinated. That is the number one job number one these days. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, and I think it's obvious from what we've seen around the world. This is the place in the world where that leadership exists, where the technologies exist, where the people who know what they're doing are here and have the experience and willingness to do the work. I think one of the other challenges, and we don't need to dwell on it too much, is these are much more challenging than just simple loss of intellectual property in the form of patents that we're talking about, right? As we know, manufacturing a drug or a vaccine isn't like reading the 3x5 card of a recipe your grandmother gave to you. It's a tremendously complicated process of which a patent is just nothing other than a tiny portion of what you do. There's drug master files, there's all of the manufacturing equipment necessary to manufacture things. It's how you manufacture the lipids that encapsulate the mRNA. It's much more complex than just saying to someone, hey, there's a patent, you go right ahead and use it.
That's right, Brad. I think that is a real misunderstanding, I think, about the complexity of this technology. A lot of people say, share the recipe, share the recipe. As you said, this is much more complicated than a recipe for some for something you cook up in the kitchen. There are 280 components to our vaccine. They come from 19 different countries. The complexity of the manufacturing process is just as important. I like to point out that the innovation is not just in the vial; it's on the factory floor. And for this vaccine, waiving patents doesn't really get you where you need to go. It doesn't create more production. The really sophisticated manufacturing processes that are involved, has the innovation involved there. It's just as critical that be protected. And what's interesting is that with this waiver proposal, it wasn't just the patents that they were proposing to be waived. They were proposing to waive all types of IP, including trade secrets. And once those are waived, once those are out in the public domain, they're gone forever. So what we've pointed out is that, if you want to give away this IP globally, you got to ask yourself, where does that leave the United States in the future? Again, as I said, we're in a very globally competitive environment now for biotechnology, and we just really need to be mindful of how to protect our strengths.
Well, thanks, Alyssa. And I think that gets to a question we had, is about what the unintended consequences are potentially of TRIPS and waiving intellectual property protection. Because it's not just the patents, it's the trade secrets, it's the know-how, it's things that you can never claw back. They're gone forever. Are there any other ones that we've missed that are potential unintended consequences we should know of?
Well, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier. I think that we want to ensure that our first of all that we don't have a scramble for the critical inputs that we are all desperately need to make sure we can scale up quickly. We want to ensure that we get really efficient manufacturing, because the truth is that scaled up efficient manufacturing of a vaccine that contributes to that contributes to the world getting vaccinated. Without that kind of efficiency in our manufacturing, we're not going to get people vaccinated as quickly. And so we need to make sure that those scarce raw materials are really sent to the folks who are making vaccine and doing it efficiently. The second thing, of course, is we want to make sure we have maintain absolute integrity, quality, safety, all of those things to make sure that our vaccines are safe and effective. And that is also pretty critical. So there's a lot of unanswered questions with the TRIPS waiver proposal. And I should say, it is not to say that we think that developing country manufacturers cannot make vaccines. In fact, we have wonderful partners in developing countries who are working with us on our vaccine manufacturing. It's just that a free-for-all for IP will create a lot of new challenges for all of us as we try to ensure that we have safe and effective vaccines in the market.
Well, thanks, Alyssa. I want to thank you very much for your time. I again want to thank Pfizer and all of your employees and associates and partners around the world who are working as hard as possible to help with this pandemic. We do truly appreciate it. Sharon, thank you so much. And to PhRMA, who represents major pharmaceutical companies around the world and helps to ensure hopefully better outcomes for all of us. On behalf of the Maryland Tech Council, I'd like to thank both of you for being here. I'd like to thank all of you who are here in the audience and more importantly, all of our members around the state. So thanks very much for joining us and we hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.